In 1957, a dying 7-year-old girl sat in the third row of an Elvis Presley concert. What happened next would stop 18,000 people cold. A crime boss walked on stage mid-song, whispered something in Elvis's ear, and 10 minutes later, grown men were wiping tears from their faces. Before we dive into this story, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. Her name was Sarah Ann Mitchell. She was 7 years old and she was dying. Sarah had been sick for 11 months. The doctors at Tupelo General Hospital called it acute lymphoblastic leukemia. In 1956, that diagnosis was a death sentence. There were no real treatments, no chemotherapy protocols that worked. The doctors gave her 6 months. She'd already outlived that by 5. Her father, Robert Mitchell, worked at the Tupelo cotton mill. 60-hour weeks for $32. Her mother, Dorothy, took in laundry to make extra money. They had 3 other children, all younger than Sarah. The medical bills had already wiped them out. Sarah's hair had fallen out in patches. She weighed 41 pounds, down from 60. Her skin had a yellowish tint that meant her liver was failing. Some days she couldn't get out of bed, but she loved Elvis Presley. She had a small transistor radio her grandmother gave her for Christmas. Every night, she'd lie in bed with that radio pressed against her ear, waiting for Elvis songs to play. She knew every word to Hound Dog, Don't, Be Cruel, and Love Me Tender. When she had enough strength, she'd sing along. Dorothy told her husband that Sarah had one wish. She wanted to see Elvis Presley perform. Once, before she died, Robert sold his truck. It was a 1949 Ford pickup he'd bought used in 1952. He sold it to a neighbor for $85. That money paid for train tickets to Tupelo and 4 concert seats, 3rd row, center section. He told Dorothy they'd figure out how to get to work later, the Mississippi, Alabama. Fair and Dairy Show wasn't supposed to host Elvis Presley on September 26, 1956. The venue had already turned him down twice. Fair organizers thought rock and roll was too controversial, too dangerous for a family event in Tupelo, Mississippi. But ticket sales were down, and they needed something big. Elvis had left Tupelo 11 years earlier. His family moved to Memphis in 1948 after his father served time for forgery. They left with nothing, packed into a 1939 Plymouth with worn-out seats and a trunk held shut with rope. Elvis was 13, poor, and carrying shame he never talked about. Now he was coming back. Not as the kid who got free lunch at school. Not as the boy whose classmates mocked his homemade clothes. He was coming back as the biggest name in music. The fair paid him $12,500 for 2 shows. That was more money than most families in Tupelo earned in 5 years. Word spread fast. By September 25th, the day before the concert, cars were already lining up outside the fairgrounds. People camped overnight in trucks and makeshift tents. The morning of September 26th brought chaos. Roads into Tupelo were jammed for miles. State troopers were called in to direct traffic. The fairgrounds could hold maybe 10,000 people. Comfortably, more than 18,000 showed up. Farmers left their fields. Factory workers called in sick. School teachers closed their classrooms early. Black families and white families stood in the same lines, which almost never happened in Mississippi in 1956, for one day. Segregation seemed to pause. Elvis's mother, Gladys, was terrified. She hadn't been back to Tupelo since they left. She told Elvis she didn't want to go, didn't want to face the people who had looked down on them. But Elvis insisted. He wanted her there. He wanted everyone who had doubted him to see what he'd become. The afternoon show was scheduled for 2:00. By noon, the crowd was already packed so tight people could barely move. The September heat was brutal. 4 degrees, no shade. Vendors ran out of water by 1:30. The day of the concert, Sarah could barely walk. Robert carried her from the train station to the fairgrounds. Dorothy had sewn her a new dress from fabric remnants, light blue with white flowers. Sarah insisted on wearing it even though she was sweating through it in the heat. They got to their seats. It's 90 minutes before the show started. Sarah sat between her parents, clutching a small stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 3. Her brothers stayed home with their aunt. People around them noticed Sarah immediately. A sick child was hard to miss. Several women offered her water. One man tried to give up his seat so she could lie down. Dorothy politely refused. Sarah didn't talk much. She was saving her energy. But her eyes were locked on the empty stage, waiting at exactly 2 o'clock. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. The crowd erupted. And then Elvis Presley walked on stage. Sarah started crying before he even sang a note. But there was someone else in that crowd. Someone whose presence that day would change everything. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson didn't look like a crime boss. He was 51 years old, stood 5'9", and dressed like a college professor. Wire-rimmed, glasses, tailored suits, soft-spoken. People who didn't know him thought he was a school teacher or maybe a preacher, but in Harlem. Everyone knew exactly who Bumpy Johnson was. He controlled the numbers racket across Upper Manhattan, illegal gambling that pulled in roughly $50,000 a week. He had connections to the Italian mob, the police department, and half the politicians in New York City. He'd been shot 3 times, stabbed twice, and spent multiple stretches in Sing Sing prison. What most people didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson was also in Tupelo, Mississippi, on September 26, 1956. He wasn't there for business. T was there because of his niece. Her name was Claire Richardson. She lived in Memphis with her mother, Bumpy's younger sister, Margaret. Claire was 14 years old and obsessed with Elvis Presley. She had posters covering every wall of her bedroom. She'd seen him perform twice already in Memphis, when she heard Elvis was performing in Tupelo. She begged her mother to take her. Margaret called her brother in New York. She needed money for tickets and a place to stay. Bumpy wired $200 the next day. But he also did something unexpected. He took a train from New York to Memphis, then drove with Margaret and Claire to Tupelo. He told his associates he'd be gone for 3 days. He didn't explain why. The truth was simpler than anyone guessed. Bumpy Johnson had a soft spot for kids, always had. In Harlem, he paid for school supplies every September, made sure families had food during Christmas. When kids got sick and families couldn't afford doctors, Bumpy covered the bills, anonymously. He'd lost his own daughter years earlier. Pneumonia. She was 6. The memory still gutted him, so when Claire asked if he'd come to the concert with them, he said yes. He bought an extra ticket, 5th row, right side. Close enough to see everything. Bumpy sat between Margaret and Claire. He watched his niece's face light up when Elvis took the stage. For a man who'd seen everything the underworld had to offer, watching a teenage girl scream over a singer seemed almost innocent. The concert started with Heartbreak Hotel. The crowd went insane. Girls were fainting. Grown women were sobbing. Security guards were overwhelmed. Elvis moved through 3 more songs. Blue Suede Shoes, I Got a Woman. House 1. Then, during the opening notes of Don't Be Cruel, something happened in the 3rd row. Bumpy saw it before most people did. A little girl slumped forward. Her mother screamed. Her father caught her before she hit the ground. The music was so loud that almost no one heard the scream. But Bumpy Johnson heard it, and without thinking, he stood up and started moving toward the stage. Security tried to stop him. Two guards stepped in front of Bumpy as he moved down the aisle. He didn't slow down. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a badge, and flashed it at them. It wasn't a real badge. It was something he'd acquired years ago through connections in the NYPD, but it looked official enough. The guards hesitated. That was all Bumpy needed. He walked past them and headed straight for the stage. Elvis was mid-verse when he noticed a man climbing the side steps. He kept singing, but his eyes tracked the movement. His band noticed too. The guitarist, Scotty Moore, tensed up. This could be anything. A crazed fan? Someone with a weapon. It had happened before, but Bumpy didn't rush. He walked calmly across the stage, hands visible. No sudden movements. Elvis stopped singing. The band stopped playing. 18,000 people went silent in less than 5 seconds. The fairgrounds manager rushed toward the stage, yelling for security. But before anyone could reach Bumpy, he was already standing next to Elvis. Elvis took a step back. His microphone was still in his hand. Bumpy leaned in close and said something that only Elvis could hear. The entire exchange lasted maybe 10 seconds. Bumpy spoke quietly. Elvis listened. Then Elvis looked out into the crowd, scanning the third row. Bumpy pointed. Elvis saw her. A little girl in a light blue dress slumped in her father's arms. Her mother was standing, frantically waving for help. People around them were shouting for a doctor. Elvis handed his microphone to Scotty Moore without saying a word. Then he walked off the stage with Bumpy Johnson. The crowd erupted in confusion. People were yelling. Some thought the show was over. Others thought something was wrong with Elvis. The fairgrounds manager grabbed the microphone and tried to calm everyone down. By the noise, backstage, Elvis pushed through a crowd of technicians and stagehands. Bumpy was right behind him. They reached the side entrance that led to the main seating area. 2 more security guards tried to block the path. Elvis didn't stop. He shoved past them and walked straight into the crowd. People recognized him immediately. Screams erupted. Girls lunged toward him. Hands reached out, grabbing at his clothes. Security scrambled to form a barrier, but the crowd was too thick. Elvis ignored all of it. He kept moving toward the third row. Robert Mitchell saw him coming. He was still holding Sarah in his arms. Dorothy was crying, trying to shield her daughter from the chaos. Sarah's eyes were barely open. Her breathing was shallow. Elvis knelt down in front of them, right there in the dirt and grass. His white suit was getting filthy. He didn't care. He looked at Sarah and said something no one else could hear. Then he reached out and gently touched her face. The crowd around them realized what was happening. The screaming stopped. People backed up, giving them space. Within seconds, a circle formed around Elvis, Sarah, and her parents. 18,000 people stood in complete silence. And then Elvis started to sing. He sang "Love Me Tender" without a microphone. No instruments, no amplification. Just his voice. Raw and unfiltered, cutting through the stillness. Sarah opened her eyes. She looked up at Elvis like she was seeing an angel. Her small hand reached out, trembling, and touched his arm. He took her hand and held it while he sang. Dorothy collapsed to her knees. She covered her mouth with both hands, sobbing so hard her entire body shook. Robert stood, frozen, still holding his daughter, tears streaming down his face. The people in the crowd closest to them started crying. Then, the people behind them. Within a minute, thousands of people were weeping openly. Grown men wiped their eyes with their sleeves. Women clutched their children. Strangers held on to each other. Bumpy Johnson stood a few feet away, watching. His face showed nothing, but his jaw was tight and his hands were clenched at his sides. Elvis finished the song. He leaned down and kissed Sarah on the forehead. Then he whispered something in her ear that made her smile. It was the first time she'd smiled in weeks. He stood up slowly, still holding her hand. He looked at Robert and Dorothy and said something. To them, whatever he said made Dorothy cry even harder. Then Elvis did something no one expected. He turned to the crowd and raised his hand, gesturing for quiet. The murmuring stopped immediately. His voice carried across the fairgrounds without a microphone. He told everyone that Sarah was his biggest fan. He said she came all the way here just to see him, and he wasn't going to let her down. He asked the crowd to sing with him. One more song. For Sarah. The band scrambled back into position. Someone handed Elvis a microphone. He stood right there in the crowd, third row, surrounded by thousands of people, and he sang Hound Dog. The entire fairgrounds erupted. 18,000 people sang along at the top of their lungs. The sound was deafening. It rattled the stage scaffolding. It shook the ground. Sarah was still in her father's arms, but now she was sitting up. She was singing too, weak, barely audible, but singing. Her face was lit up in a way her parents hadn't seen in almost a year. When the song ended, Elvis handed the microphone back to a stagehand. He hugged Robert. He hugged Dorothy. He kissed Sarah one more time. Then, surrounded by security, he made his way back through the crowd toward the stage. The applause was thunderous. People were screaming his name. But Elvis didn't acknowledge any of it. He climbed back on stage, took the microphone from Scotty Moore, and wiped his eyes. He didn't say anything. He just nodded to the band, and they started the next song. But everything had changed. Sarah Ann Mitchell died 17 days later, October 13th, 1956, a Saturday morning. She passed away at home with her family around her. Dorothy was holding her hand. Robert was sitting on the edge of the bed. Her brothers were in the hallway, too young to fully understand what was happening. The funeral was held at First Baptist Church in Tupelo. More than 200 people attended. Most of them were neighbors and family friends. But there were also people Sarah's parents didn't recognize. People who'd been at the concert. People who'd witnessed what happened in the third row. The local newspaper ran a small obituary. It mentioned that Sarah had attended the Elvis Presley concert 2 weeks before she died. It said her parents considered it the happiest day of her life. Elvis never knew she died. He left Tupelo the night of the concert and went straight to a show in Dallas, then Houston, then back to Memphis for recording sessions. His schedule was relentless. 3 cities a week, sometimes more. He was barely sleeping, living on coffee and adrenaline. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, controlled every aspect of his life. Parker decided which shows he played, which songs he recorded, who he talked to. Parker didn't care about fan mail or personal stories, cared about money and publicity. Letters poured into Elvis's management office by the thousands every week. Most of them were never opened. Secretaries sorted them into bins. Some got generic responses. Most got thrown away. Dorothy Mitchell wrote to Elvis 3 times after Sarah died. She wanted to thank him. She wanted him to know how much that moment meant to her daughter. She included a photograph of Sarah holding the stuffed rabbit she'd brought to the concert. None of those letters ever reached him. Years later. In 1960, a journalist asked Elvis about the Tupelo concert. He remembered it clearly. He said it was one of the most emotional performances of his career. But when the journalist mentioned Sarah by name and told him she'd died, Elvis went quiet. He didn't know. The interview ended shortly after that. Elvis excused himself and left the room. According to people who were there, he didn't come out for over an hour. He never spoke publicly about Sarah again. But those close to him said the story stayed with him. Priscilla Presley mentioned it years later in an interview. She said Elvis carried guilt about it. He wondered if he could have done more, if he should have visited Sarah in the hospital. If he'd failed her somehow, he hadn't failed her. But he never believed that. Bumpy Johnson went back to New York too, days after the concert. He never talked about what happened. Not to his associates. Not to his sister Margaret. Not even to his niece Claire. But something shifted in him after Tupelo. In the months that followed, Bumpy started doing something unusual. He began paying medical bills for sick children in Harlem, quietly, anonymously. Families would show up at hospitals and be told their balances were cleared. No explanation. No paperwork trail. Doctors and nurses knew it was him. They didn't ask questions. They just accepted the money and helped the kids. One nurse at Harlem's hospital later said Bumpy covered expenses for at least 40 families between 1957 and 1962. Chemotherapy, surgeries, experimental treatments. He paid for everything, tens of thousands of dollars. Money that could have gone toward expanding his operations or buying protection. He never asked for recognition, never used it as leverage. He just paid the bills and walked away. Margaret asked him once why he was doing it. He told her he didn't want any more kids dying when something could be done. That was the only explanation he ever gave. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. Heart attack. He collapsed outside Wells Restaurant in Harlem while playing cards. He was 62 years old. His funeral drew hundreds of people. Crime figures, politicians, everyday Harlem residents whose lives he'd touched in ways they never fully understood. The police presence was massive. They expected violence, rival factions, settling scores. It never came. What most people at that funeral didn't know was that 12 families sent flowers. Families whose children had survived cancer, heart defects, and other illnesses because Bumpy Johnson paid for their care. The cards attached to those flowers all said the same thing. Thank you for giving us more time. No one connected those flowers to what happened in Tupelo 12 years earlier. No one knew that a dying 7-year-old girl in Mississippi had changed the way a crime boss thought about life and legacy. But the connection was there. Bumpy Johnson walked onto that stage because he saw a child in trouble and couldn't look away. That single decision rippled outward in ways he never intended. It didn't erase the violence. It didn't make him a good man. But it proved something he'd probably never admitted to himself. Even monsters can have moments of grace. The Tupelo concert changed how Elvis Presley performed. Not immediately. Not in obvious ways. But the shift was there. Before Tupelo, Elvis was a showman. He worked the crowd. He played up the sexuality and rebellion that made him famous. He gave audiences what they wanted. Energy, danger, spectacle. After Tupelo, something softened. He started noticing people in the crowds differently. Between songs, he'd scan the audience, looking for faces, looking for stories. His band members noticed it. Scotty Moore mentioned it in an interview years later. He said Elvis became more present during performances, less performative. In 1957, during a concert in Philadelphia, Elvis stopped mid-show when he saw a wheelchair in the front row. A teenage boy, cerebral palsy. Elvis walked off stage, sat next to him, and talked for 5 minutes while 18,000 people waited. He didn't make a big announcement. He didn't turn it into a moment. He just did it. It happened again in Chicago, then Detroit, then Los Angeles. Anytime Elvis saw someone who was sick or disabled in the crowd, he'd find a way to acknowledge them. Sometimes he'd bring them backstage. Sometimes he'd dedicate a song. Sometimes he'd just make eye contact and nod. The press called it a publicity stunt. Colonel Parker encouraged that narrative because it sold tickets. But the people around Elvis knew better. Priscilla said he never wanted cameras around for those moments. He got angry when photographers tried to capture them. This wasn't about image. It was about something else. By the early 1960s, Elvis was getting letters from families asking him to visit sick children in hospitals. He couldn't do all of them. His schedule wouldn't allow it. But he did more than anyone expected. He visited St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis multiple times. He paid for medical equipment. He covered treatment costs for families who couldn't afford them. He wrote personal checks that his accountant would later describe as financially reckless. In 1961, he donated his entire paycheck from a concert in Hawaii to build a memorial for the USS Arizona, over $50,000. When reporters asked why, he said he wanted to do something that mattered. People close to him said he was searching for something. Redemption? Maybe. Or proof that fame could be used for more than just making money. He never mentioned Sarah Mitchell by name, but her ghost followed him in private moments. When he was alone or with people he trusted, he'd talk about Tupelo, about the girl in the blue dress, about how helpless he felt, how he wished he could have saved her. He couldn't. But he spent the rest of his life trying to save someone. The official story about the Tupelo concert left out important details. Details that didn't surface until decades later. The fairgrounds manager, a man named Carl Hayes, gave an interview. In 1981, he was 73 years old and dying of lung cancer. He said he needed to set the record straight about what happened that day. According to Hayes, Bumpy Johnson didn't just walk onto the stage on impulse. He'd been watching Sarah Mitchell since before the concert started. He saw her condition. He saw how frail she was, and he made a decision. Before Elvis went on stage, Bumpy approached Hayes backstage. He identified himself, showed credentials that Hayes later admitted were probably fake, and told him there was a sick child in the audience. He said if something went wrong during the show, he was going to stop it. Hayes could either cooperate or get out of the way. Hayes tried to refuse. He told Bumpy that stopping a concert for one person wasn't fair to the other 18,000 people who paid for tickets. Bumpy's response was blunt. He said fairness didn't matter when a kid was dying. Hayes backed down. He didn't want trouble. So when Bumpy walked onto that stage, Hayes didn't send security to stop him. He let it happen. There was something else Hayes revealed. After Elvis came back on stage and finished the concert, Bumpy Johnson handed Hayes an envelope. Inside was $500 in cash. A note was attached. It said, "For the family in the third row. It's medical expenses." Hayes tracked down Robert and Dorothy Mitchell the next day. He gave them the money. Kay told them it was from an anonymous donor who'd been at the concert. Kay never mentioned Bumpy Johnson's name. Dorothy used that money to pay for Sarah's final weeks at home. It covered a nurse, pain medication, a proper bed. Things they couldn't have afforded otherwise. When Hayes finished telling the story in 1981, the interviewer asked why he'd kept it secret for 25 years. Hayes said he'd made a promise. Bumpy had told him not to talk about it. And even though Bumpy had been dead for over a decade, Hayes felt obligated to keep his word. He only spoke up because he wanted people to know the truth. Not the sanitized version, the real one. Sometimes the most important parts of a story are the ones nobody sees. Robert Mitchell kept his daughter's blue dress for the rest of his life. He stored it in a wooden box in his closet, wrapped in tissue paper. He never threw it away, never donated it. It was the dress Sarah wore the day she met Elvis Presley. That made it sacred. Dorothy lived until 1993. She was 71 when she died. In her final years, she'd tell the story about Tupelo to anyone who'd listen. Her grandchildren heard it dozens of times. The girl in the third row, the crime boss. Who stopped the show? It's a singer who knelt in the dirt and held her daughter's hand. Most people thought she was exaggerating, making it bigger than it was. Grief does that. Memories get polished over time until they shine brighter than the truth. But Dorothy wasn't exaggerating. Every detail was accurate. Other people who were there confirmed it. Newspaper clippings backed it up. Photographs existed. Grainy, black and white images of Elvis in the crowd, kneeling next to a small girl in a light blue dress. The story should have been famous. It had everything. A dying child, a massive star, an act of pure humanity in front of thousands of witnesses. But it got buried, lost in the noise of Elvis's career and the chaos of the 1950s. It resurfaced briefly in the 1980s, when a documentary filmmaker tried to make a film about it. He interviewed Dorothy. He tracked down people who'd been at the concert. He found Carl Hayes and got the story about Bumpy Johnson's envelope. But the project fell apart. Funding issues. Legal problems with the Presley estate. The footage sat in a warehouse for years, unfinished and forgotten. In 2005, a journalist writing a book about Elvis's early career stumbled across the story again. She contacted Sarah's surviving family members. She dug through archives. He pieced together what happened in Tupelo on September 26, 1956. The book sold modestly, a few thousand copies. It didn't make bestseller lists. But the people who read it remembered it, because the story wasn't really about Elvis. It wasn't about Bumpy Johnson. It wasn't even about Sarah Mitchell. It was about what happens when someone chooses compassion over convenience. When 18,000 people stand in silence and bear witness to grace. When a single moment proves that even in a broken world, humanity still flickers. That's the legacy, not fame, not headlines. It's just the quiet truth that love, even briefly, can stop time.